rainout, I would think. Guerrero hits it high, hits it deep to left center field. Mumphrey on his horse, going, can't get it. Say scores from third. Here comes Baker, rounding third. Guerrero heading for third. In with a triple, and the Dodgers have got the big inning going. Ball is lifted out into left center field. Mumphrey can't get it. Garvey scores. Here comes Thomas to the plate. The throw to third, not in time. Double Guerrero. 2 runs are in. And it's becoming a blowout. 8-1 Los Angeles. That ball is well hit in the corner. Winfield loping over, and it's in the seats. It's a home run. Well, Pedro Guerrero. Will there be some call for a second ballot here?
Might have to take another look. Clutch home run to tie the game Sunday. Tremendous day today.
Welcome back. We're here for season 5 of For the Defense. My name is David Oscar Markus, and I'm so excited to be back with you, talking with some of the greatest trial lawyers about the biggest and best cases that we've had in our country's history. I'm really excited about our lineup of guests this season. We have Barry Scheck from the Innocence Project, Jerry Lefcourt from the Chicago 7, Abby Hoffman's trial, Lisa Wayne, the current president of NACDL, Matt Menschel, lots of others. It's going to be a really fun and great season. But first up, and I'm so honored and happy to have him, is my former law partner, Milton Hirsch, who's a current sitting judge here in Miami, Florida. And Milton is one of the finest trial lawyers around. He's truly one of the greats. And so it's a great privilege to have him on the podcast. And I think you're going to find this case a lot of fun. We speak to Milt about the Pedro Guerrero trial. Pedro Guerrero was an MVP in Major League Baseball, just a sick athlete, sick baseball player. And he got charged down here in Miami with a drug case. And Milt famously defended him in federal court. And the defense was, in general terms, he was too stupid to have done the drug deal that they're accusing him of doing. It was a crazy defense and a successful defense. You'll hear about how Milt did it, how he won the case, all the ins and outs. It's a really fascinating case study. And so let's get right into it with Milton Hirsch on For the Defense. All right, I'm here with the great Milton Hirsch, not only my friend, but my former partner, mentor. He's now a sitting state court judge, and we're going to talk about one of the great all-time defenses and cases. Welcome to the show, Milt.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.
So we're going to talk about the Pedro Guerrero case, which is such a fun case in defense. Why don't you tell us a little about who Pedro Guerrero is and how you got the case?
Well, it was, we've forgotten about Pedro. Baseball heroes come and go. But in the pre-steroids era, he was one of the very great baseball players. I think he's the first guy to have a multi-million-dollar contract for a single year. Of course, nowadays that's lunch money, but in those days that was a big deal. He played mostly for the Dodgers and at the tail end of his career with the Cardinals. And he, like a remarkable number of ball players, he grew up in a little town called San Pedro de Macorís, which is a little town in the Dominican Republic that has proved to be a cradle, a factory of baseball players. He being one, Sammy Sosa, there were many others. And in a sense, the story of the trial starts there, really.
So, and we'll get into that for sure. But, as criminal defense lawyers, when you were criminal defense lawyers, one of the things we have to do when we meet with a client is tell them about conflicts. Did you tell Pedro that you're a huge Cub fan and it was going to be hard for you to represent an all-time Cardinal? Great.
We got over that in a hurry. That wasn't a particular problem.
Okay. So, one of the things that people are always interested in and always appreciate when I ask is how criminal defense lawyers get cases. So I know you're a judge now, you don't have to worry about that. But when you were a criminal defense lawyer, how would you even go about getting a case like Pedro Guerrero?
Most of my work, David, as you know, I had friends and contemporaries at large and mid-sized civil and commercial firms. And if each one of those firms referred me a case once a year, and there were 12 or 15 of those firms, that was my practice.
Right.
This came to me a little bit differently. It was a little unusual. A longtime friend of mine who did criminal practice, Jeff Feiler, and who remained involved in this case in a kind of a background way, also was cultivating some sports representation and celebrity representation practice. He had another young lawyer who did that with him. And when they got this case, they were concerned that because of the complexity and some of the legal issues and problems associated with it, they didn't want to take responsibility for it, which I think was generous on their part. I think they were thinking the best interest of the client. And so they brought me in.
So what was Pedro charged with?
Possession with intent to distribute and conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute.
Cocaine.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you get
I'm sorry, I took that for granted. In my day, everything was cocaine.
Yeah.
Everything was cocaine.
So you get this case, Guerrero, all-time great baseball player, charged in federal court. The defense, and we'll get into this great defense, is he's just not smart enough to have really done a drug deal. Do you talk to him about, this is going to be the defense in your case, like it or not?
Oftentimes when I spoke to him, he would nod and smile. And I was often concerned about whether we were really communicating. There were a couple of junctures during the trial when he came to me and said that someone had told him that I was saying that he was not very bright and that hurt his feelings. But he was a very sweet guy. But I explained to him that, we say things to try to create an effective defense, and that, he shouldn't take this as necessarily an expression of my feelings about it.
And so was he okay with the defense, or was he upset? Because there were rumors that he was not happy that this was the defense.
There were a couple of junctures where he was unhappy, but he got over it. He was happy at the end.
Yeah, at the end, I'm sure he got over it really quickly. So let's talk about getting ready for the trial. So you get the discovery in federal court back then. You get very little discovery, but one of the things you get are tape recordings, of course.
Yeah.
And Pedro's on some of the tapes. Can you give us a flavor for the tape recordings that he's on and the trouble that you see in the case?
Yeah, this was, the DEA group that did this was a terrific. These guys were outstanding. They were really good. I even remember the head of the group was a guy named Sandy Tilley. He was just an outstanding agent. In fact, after the trial was over, he called me to tell me it was the first time they had ever lost, that they had never made a case that didn't result in conviction. So these guys were very thorough and meticulous. And there were a couple of meetings where Pedro shows up at a Hooters. He loved Hooters. He's very fond of Hooters. He liked drinking beer, and he liked looking at girls in short skirts and tight glasses. That was his principal interest in his retirement life. And everyone seated at this table was either a DEA agent or a not informant, except Pedro. Everyone else seated at the table. So they had these elaborate tape recordings. And when you read them, they're deadly. They're just horrible. They go on in great detail. And I think one of the key moments, one of the real epiphanies in the trial of this case was that I did something, and David, I take no credit for this. I take no credit for this. I always believed that it was the job of a criminal trial lawyer to study the work of the great criminal trial lawyers before him and in his own time, and to use as much as possible from what they did. So
we steal.
It's not stealing. It's absolutely on the up and up. And in fact, frankly, I'm disappointed that nowadays I don't see more young lawyers sitting in courtrooms or leafing through transcripts and trying to pick up tips from the David Marcuses. I think there should be more of that. But I had learned, it was certainly not original with me by no means. It was perfectly obvious to me what to do with these deadly tape transcripts that went on and on and on. What I did was, I took these transcripts and I split them into two transcripts. One had everything that was said by everyone at the table except Pedro. And one had just Pedro's contribution to the conversation. So you have this one transcript where there's DEA agents and informers talking about, we should do a massive drug deal in violation of Title 21 of the United States. I mean, it was almost as express as that. They were pouring it on. And you look at all the contribution Pedro made, and it was in Spanish, but the English language version is, okay, ooh, look at that. Can I get a beer? And that was it. And that over and over and over again. And during the cross of this really terrific DEA agent, and there just wasn't much he could do. It's not because I was particularly clever or terrific. There it was being displayed. This is everything all of you said, and here's everything Pedro said, and that's his entire contribution. And honestly, it was one of those unusual trials where you see the jury just doing that kind of.
Right. I love it. Now, you talked about looking at the old transcripts and of great trial lawyers. I remember you always talking about Frank Oliver. Was this a Frank Oliver tactic?
It was not. It was not. That was not from Frank. I remember that. But David, there were so many. I still have boxes and boxes of transcripts. I may have some of yours, by the way, but I have great crosses, great closings, great openings from great lawyers going back. Some very recently and some years and years ago. And we all need to study.
So, one of the issues is people don't have those transcripts and don't know about some of these people. Of course, everybody knows Edward Bennett Williams. Everybody knows Lee Bailey. Everybody knows Roy Black. Not everybody knows about people like Frank Oliver. Tell us about him and what kind of lawyer he was and any good story before we get back into Guerrero.
Frank was a terrific, brilliant man, a little eccentric to the point of crazy. He practiced out of Chicago, although he traveled around a lot. And in the 50s and into the 60s, he did a lot of mob work. He did a lot of mafia representation. And his product was brilliant. Now, his style of cross-examination, you would not adopt today because his questions were very lengthy and ornate and full of references to a classical, Greek mythology and things like that. You wouldn't do that today. I know that you are well familiar with the work of Terry McCarthy, who was the federal public defender in Chicago for years and years, and who knew Frank and who studied Frank's work, but was the first to say that although Frank's stuff was brilliant, you had to be Frank to do Frank.
Yeah. Well, in reading the transcripts from this case, I say you have to be Milt to do Milt. I mean, the stuff you did in this case was great. So one of the transcripts I did not have, but I love talking about your voir dire. One of the things you do, I cannot do, which is you get the list of juror names and you immediately memorize them all and speak to them and call them out by name. Tell us how you came to do that and how you're able to do it, because I could never do it.
I was taught that. I don't remember by whom. It's probably some great previous lawyer who was in the habit of, but I think that nowadays particularly, we are so accustomed to our cell phones, our computers, the written word, that really we're unaccustomed to using our memory for very much. Now in federal court, generally you don't get voir dire. I was fortunate to have gotten voir dire in that case.
What'd you get, 10 minutes?
I don't remember, but I was grateful for whatever I got.
Yeah.
In state court, as you know, in Florida and in many state jurisdictions, it's just the opposite. You have to let the lawyers drone on and on and on. But in federal cases, once in a blue moon, you'll get some voir dire. And what I did, I'm telling you, I'm a sitting judge. This borders on not good practices. But at the conclusion of all my questions, I would pick a a softball question. Mr. Markus, can you give my client a fair trial, a full and fair trial, or some silly thing like that? And I would go through all the jurors, all the people in the venire. Mr. Smith, Ms. Jones, Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Hernandez, whatever, naming each one and asking them some very simple question that they would say yes to. And when I get all the way through all of them, there might be, 50 or 60 or however many there were, before I would stop, I would say, well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all the questions I have for you. But I'm reluctant to sit down because I really do think that voir dire, this part of the trial, is the best and most important part because it's the only time that you get to speak to us. So if there's anything you want to say or anything you'd like to ask, before I sit down, here's your last chance. And about one trial in three, somebody in the back would raise his or her hand and say, how did you remember all our names?
Great, yeah.
And that was a gift from God because the answer to that is, Mr. Markus, if you could take the time and trouble out of your life to come down and defend the rights of my innocent client, the least I can do is take the time and trouble to remember your name. And then sit down.
Now, when a young PD does that in your courtroom after listening to this podcast, you can't throw him out. You have to let him do it.
I hope nobody will do that. It is a dubious. It's right on the edge.
So let's get into the opening because I have the transcript here, and if anybody wants it, they should just email me because I'll, with your permission, send them the transcript. Which
of course,
is just
it's public
awesome.
record.
So obviously, Pedro is this great baseball player, and I love how you start the opening because you talk about how in every baseball game the visiting team bats first and the home team bats in the bottom of the inning, sort of making the government the visiting team and the defense the home team. I
wasn't going to pass that up, David. I was not going to pass that up. That was a chance you don't get very much.
Yeah, I love that. And then you talk about, let's go through the lineup for the visiting team, and you talk about all the snitches who they're going to be calling, which I also really, really like just the imagery of, here's their lineup, here's who they're relying on, and here's all the bad things about them.
Yeah, actually, the two worst snitchers, they never called. They talked about him relentlessly. One of them had brought Pedro into the case, taking advantage of a sort of a distant family connection. But they were ashamed to call these people. But it was clear that they were going to be at the center of the case, whether they actually came to court or not. And in a way, that was the best of all possible worlds for us.
They don't call them, but you're still obviously allowed to bring out what they've been paid and so on. And you do that right in the opening. You talk about how one of them, I think, got over $650,000 and was on a contingency. In this case, I mean, you don't see that all the time where if there was a conviction and a forfeiture, the snitch gets paid.
Yeah. And remember, this is 23 years ago. $650,000 was a vast fortune. I mean, jurors' mouths fell open when we talked about that kind of money. And he would get another $17,500 if they returned a guilty verdict against Pedro.
I mean, just unbelievable. It's no wonder they didn't call him. Did you ever have a thought to call the snitches, or you were happy that they weren't called?
No, I didn't want them. I was able to attack their credibility without them coming to court. And as you've seen in closing argument, I got to do something that we don't get to do often.
We'll get there. Don't jump the gun. So down the line, you go through the snitches, of course, in opening, and then you talk about your client, Pedro, and I'll read a little of it because it's so good. So you say Pedro Guerrero got about as far as the 6th grade. He didn't quite finish. And the reason that is very simple. Pedro didn't understand what was going on in school. Then you talk about, now the Lord spreads his bounty unevenly. Some of us are made wise and some foolish, some tall and some short, some fat and some thin, some talented and some without talents. The evidence in this case will show, and we'll be talking about this later in the course of the trial, that Pedro Guerrero has almost no talent in so many ways. He suffers from a profoundly depressed IQ, far from below normal. We'll talk about that in a minute. He suffers from a clinically diagnosed dependent personality. But there's one thing Pedro Guerrero could do just about better than anyone in the whole wide world. By the time he was 13 or 14-year-old, they figured out that Pedro Guerrero could hit a baseball. I mean, that is just good stuff, right?
At the moment when I said that, I took out from the podium a baseball that I had placed there before I got up to opening. And I just tossed it up in the air and a little bit and caught it and held it.
Oh, so good. Now, again, like I mentioned before, there were rumors that when you say those things about Guerrero's intelligence in opening, he when he heard that, he was not a happy camper.
Well, he didn't react to things going on in the moment. People would talk to him. Family members would talk to him. The other thing was the press. There was a tremendous press attention. I mean, the publicity that this case got, and remarkably, in sports pages all over the country, in Los Angeles, in St. Louis, in New York, and of course in Miami. And what was going on behind the scenes was, a friend or a neighbor or a family member would say, "Hey, Pedro, I saw in the paper that your lawyer says you're stupid." And he would come to see me and say, "Hey, don't say that I'm stupid." And I would have to explain to him what was actually going on.
It's interesting, right? Because obviously that was a theme of your opening, but it wasn't the main theme. I mean, the main theme seemed to be how much the snitches were getting paid, that Pedro didn't say much at the meetings, that he really wasn't involved. Of course, another theme was that he was too stupid. But I mean, everybody, the media, everybody in town was talking about, the too stupid defense.
Oh, yeah. And, obviously, as is the case with you now, when I was in practice, most of my friends and the people I spent a lot of time with were fellow criminal defense attorneys. And of course, Miami has been blessed with terrific criminal defense attorneys over the years. And in the wake of this trial, I was constantly joking with all my friends and colleagues that I had gotten up in closing argument and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this man, who could have any lawyer in America that he wanted and chose me, is too stupid for you to hold him responsible for his choices." And the jury looked back at me and said, "When you put it that way, not guilty."
That's great. That's great. The line that all the press picked up on from your opening and really went with it about the too stupid defense was this one. It says, "I will prove to you, ladies and gentlemen, that all this conversation about Pedro Guerrero financing or underwriting a drug deal is ludicrous, that this man has neither the financial acumen nor the wherewithal, the dollars and cents to finance anything more complicated than lunch. And the evidence will make that clear." Everybody picked up on the lunch line.
Yeah, well, because we were going to hear a lot about what went on in Hooters, and that Pedro he's a little unenlightened in his remarks about Hooters waitresses.
The other really interesting thing that struck me from the opening and throughout the trial was that, they arrest Pedro at his house. Without a warrant, they just everybody goes with guns blazing, and they bring him in to interview him, and they confront him. And at first, he doesn't know what they're talking about, and then when confronted, he starts to cry.
Yeah,
and you made a big deal about this. I love the embracing the bad fact. I would have thought initially the government would say, "Look, he's caught," and he starts to cry, realizing he's going to go to jail for the next 20 years of his life. But you flipped that on him.
I tried to use that twice. One was in the cross of this agent Lacerna, who, as I say, was an absolutely terrific agent. And I asked him, I said, "And when you finally made clear to me that what you were talking about was a drug deal involving cocaine," he started to cry. Yes. And when we say cry, Agent Lacerna, there are tears rolling down his cheeks. And he says to me, "Well, yes, because he knew he'd been caught. He was going to go to prison." And I said, "Agent, did it ever occur to you that a man would cry if he was going to go to prison for something he didn't do?" And he kind of huffed and puffed a little bit, but I was happy with the question. I wasn't concerned with the answer.
Right.
And I came back to it again in closing. I'm making the same point.
They teach first-year lawyers, don't ask questions that you don't know the answer to. You don't know how he's going to respond to those questions. Do you care about how he's going to respond?
Look, in federal court, there's no discovery. If you don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, there's nothing to ask. You have to take calculated risks. And there is such a thing as questions that you don't care about the answer. It's not common, but it happens. On that particular question, Yeah, I knew he was going to come back and say, well, guilty, blah, blah, blah. But I was able to say, so you never considered the possibility that someone would cry because he was going to be going to prison for something he didn't do. That never even crossed your mind.
Right. Doesn't matter.
I don't care. Yeah. I don't care. And I came back to it in closing because they had conceded. Look, this guy he was MVP of the World Series. This is the guy, I said in closing, this is the guy you want standing in against Nolan Ryan with 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth and the bases loaded. He's the Iceman. He's nerves of steel. And here he is sitting in the DEA headquarters out by Doral, sobbing like a little baby.
Crazy. So Milt, you practice both in federal and state court. And now, of course, you're a judge in state court where depositions are allowed. There's full discovery in state court. In federal court, it's the opposite. No depots, no discovery. You now have the perspective from the bench of how that plays out. Should the federal courts be more like the state courts or the state courts more like the federal court?
Well, the original idea of plenary discovery in state court was that in Florida in the 70s, the late 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, the volume of cases because of the drug trafficking, the money laundering, and so on was so overwhelming in state court and the violence. Discovery will turn a 3-week trial into a 3-day trial because in federal court, you don't know where you're going on cross until you've been crossing a guy for a while. So I think there is a certain, people don't recognize, people say, oh, deposition is a waste of time, waste of resources. In terms of in-court time, it's one of the most efficient tools that you can have. And I did, obviously, I have a point of view, David, as do you, but I always felt that federal courts would be better and fairer in their trial process if there was some measure of discovery.
And speaking of differences, obviously, you got 10 or 15 minutes, whatever it was in this case for voir dire. In a state court case like this, I mean, how much time do you give the lawyers to do voir dire?
You really can't limit it. The law is that until you catch lawyers repeating themselves or asking something so hopelessly irrelevant that it couldn't possibly relate to this case, you have to let them go on. Now, there, I think that's wrong. I think it should be, I'm in favor of attorney conducted voir dire, but I think there should be limits as to content and time, and we don't have that. And I don't see lawyers making good use of their time because they don't have to.
When you were doing a state court voir dire as a criminal defense lawyer, how much time would you think is the right amount of time to use? Would you spend an hour, a couple hours? What was it?
That's like, what hat size should everybody wear, David? Every case is different, and there are different issues and different consequences. But I remember, it's the same thing with closing argument. There are judges, state and federal, who will say, you have X amount of time for closing argument. I've never done that in my life. And when I was a young lawyer, Ellen Morphonius, who's a legendary judge in this jurisdiction, I saw her asked, how much time do I get for closing? Some lawyer asked her, and she said, counsel, I don't limit closing argument. If you talk too long, the jury will know what to do with it. And I thought, ooh, that's a lesson to be learned.
And Roy Black just wrote an op-ed in the Daily Business Review criticizing a judge here in town for limiting closing argument. Roy says you should take as long as you need.
Get up and close. And if you talk too long, trust me, the jury, we need to have faith in the jury system. You and I do. I think a lot of people preach it but don't practice it. When lawyers talk too long and redundantly, the jury will inflict the punishment. The judge doesn't need to produce that.
So let's talk about some of the crosses of the agents that you had. I mean, one of the obviously big things, and we've touched upon it, is how much money the snitches were getting paid. You contrasted that, of course, with how much money Pedro was getting paid, which was zero.
Right.
What was the government's theory on this? I mean, why was Pedro involved if he was not getting a penny out of it?
They were never expressed, and there was the implication that there was somehow more behind it, that somehow he was either going to benefit this time or in some unidentified, unsketched out manner. And that was a problem, I thought, for the government, particularly because, as I said, everybody else was in it for the money.
Right.
They're not the DEA agents, but in their way, and the informers for sure.
The informers also got what is called in the business as an S visa.
Yeah.
And you made a big deal on cross-examination about the S visa. Can you tell us a little about what an S visa is and how you used it to your advantage?
Yeah. S visas are very rare. The received wisdom in the legal community is that S stands for snitch, but of course the government will deny that emphatically. On rare occasions, people who are snitches, who are cooperating or somehow benefiting the government, will be permitted visas, even though they qualify in no way at all. And what's fabulous about these S visas, if you read them, you look at the questions that are asked. Did you torture people for the Nazis? Were you part of Stalin's communist? Have you sodomized barnyard fowl? I mean, the questions that are on them are just appalling. And you want to, if you have a witness against you who is the recipient of an S visa, of course, you want to make clear that the government, before providing him this extraordinary consideration, felt itself obliged to ask him the following questions.
Right. You've mentioned how important it is to read transcripts and go to court and watch. I mean, when you were a young lawyer, what lawyers did you look up to? Were you watching? Were you reading transcripts of to learn how to do these kinds of crosses?
Well, the transcripts, you can get transcripts going back to Thomas Erskine, in the late 17 and early 1800s. There's trial transcripts and books relating to stuff that go way back. I was very fortunate in that when I was a young lawyer in this community, you could go to court and see Ed Carhart or Jay Hogan or Roy Black or Jack De Niro or Neil Sonnet or Ed Shohat or Ted Klein or Richie Sharpstein and I ended up having co-defendants with all these guys, but I started out by watching them. And it was, as Judge Robert Snowland, federal judge, a friend of ours, yours and mine, says, I was working on my PhD in trialology.
That's great. One story I don't think we've told on the podcast, maybe you could tell it, is the Jay Hogan story where he brought to court something under a big sheet.
Jay was certainly one of the greatest trial lawyers anybody ever saw. And, it's a cliche that great trial preparation makes you a great trial lawyer. And, everyone from Louis Nizer to Roger Dodd and Larry Posner and all the great trial practitioners and trial teachers teach that lesson. Jay had a case in which it turned out that the star witness, it was a snitch, I guess, or a cooperating witness of some kind, had just sold his house. And Jay showed up the next day a couple days later, the new homeowner was moving in. And this witness was one of those people. This is common enough. I had a grandfather like this. The garage never had room for the car because he was a pack rat. It was just packed full of stuff.
Right.
And Jay, if you remember Jay, and I know you do, Jay could strike up a conversation with a department store mannequin. I mean, he was just what he wanted to be. He could be the most affable guy you ever met in the world. And he'd start chatting with this total stranger. Oh, you bought this house. He said, wow, all that stuff in the garage. What are you going to do with that? And the guy says, oh, I have to probably pay $1,000 to get it home. Jay says to him, I give you $200 for everything in the garage. And the guy looks over Jay's shoulders like a man with a white coat and butterfly net's going to show up. He says, you're going to pay me for the junk in the garage? Yeah. Boom, done. Jay takes this stuff, and it's just tons of garbage. And 90% of it is just that. It's garbage. But it turns out that this guy had a sort of a monomania. He seemed the most normal of individuals, except in one bizarre respect. He had a fixation with the platinum bombshell of the 30s and 40s movies, Gene Harlow. There are great black and white movies showing her in sequin dresses with feather boas and platinum blonde hair. She was briefly married to Humphrey Bogart. And, well, maybe she wasn't, but somebody was. All right, anyway. This witness was just obsessed with her and had elaborate diaries in which he talked about feeling her come down, her spirit come down and actually inhabit her. And he would chant. Right? Now, when trial began, this guy at some point early on in the trial was called by the prosecution. He's on the witness stand for what must have seemed like days. It may have been days. And he's just burying Jay's daughter, just burying him alive. Meantime, next to Jay is this enormous easel. It's 6 foot plus in height with a bed sheet thrown over it so nobody can see what it is. And Jay's not letting you look. And when direct is finally over, Jay's guy looks deader than dead. The judge was Jose Gonzalez, wonderful judge. He looks over and says, Mr. Hogan crosses in, and Jay gets up. Jay was a big guy. It took him a while to stand up. And he swept the sheet off the easel, sort of like a matador. And there was a larger than life-size blow-up captured from a movie in black and white of Jean Harlow, blonde hair, feather boa, sequin gown, the works. And he stands there for a minute, no great rush. And he looks at the witness and says, you know who that is. And the guy's eyes are bugging in his head and he says, tell the jury who that is. And the guy says, it's me. It goes on from there. Well, he's beating this guy to a pulp. Finally, he starts to move on to the substance of the case. And the prosecutor, I'm trying to remember, it may have been Billy Xantopoulos, who's a good lawyer. The prosecutor was a very good lawyer. He drags himself to his feet and says, Judge, if Mr. Hogan is done with that, could we cover it back up again? And Jay says, oh, no, I'm coming back to that.
It's great. It's great. See, we need that's the point of this podcast, really, is to talk about these old, great stories and trials.
Well, but David, you're performing an invaluable service because young lawyers must realize that there is such a great tradition that they are becoming a part of, and that there has been so much great lawyering in the English-speaking world, in England, in this country. There's such a great tradition. And, you hear people complain all the time, well, if I tried to do what Clarence Darrow did, or if I tried to do what so-and-so would ever Bennett Williams did, the judge nowadays would shut me down. I appeared many times before a wonderful judge. He's still alive, although long retired. Wonderful man, Martin Kahn. And he said to me when I took the bench, he said, the rule is, if you're entertaining me, the other guy's objection is overruled.
That's great. I love it.
I was never given a better bit of advice from one judge to another.
That's great. And speaking of which, we'll look at your closing because I love how you start out. So you start out your closing by telling the jurors that you're the snitch. My name is Jorge Gasca.
David, I have to tell you, I have struggled to remember. Now, this is 23 years ago. I remember that what I wanted to do was walk over to the witness stand and sit down. Now, that's awfully hard to get away with in federal court. And the judge who presided over this trial, although a very fine judge, was not from a state court trial background. He was a big firm background, and so a stickler for protocol and demeanor. But in my mind's eye, I am walking over to the witness stand and sitting there and then looking at the jury and saying, my name is Jorge Gasca. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's Nelson Rodriguez or something else entirely. Maybe you'll never know my name. Maybe they don't want you to know my name. Now, David, if I did sit in the witness stand, I would have been shot by Marshall. But as I remember, that's what happened because so much had depended on this guy. And of course they hadn't called me. And I went on and on about what there was to say.
It's so good. And, It's one of those things that we say we're going to do at Macon, Georgia, and some of these other trial ad places, but nobody ever does it. You did it.
Yeah. Now, it has to be the right set of facts and the right opportunity. You can't force it. But I took my time, and finally I built up to where I said, my name is Jorge Gasca. I've been given this and this and this by the government, but the one thing I want that I don't have is the head of a sports star, a celebrity on a platter. Won't you give that to me?
Oh.
Won't you give that to Jorge Gasca? And then I walked away and began, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case, blah, 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 blah. But I was very satisfied with the exordium.
It's really good stuff. So one thing that you do, and again, I could never do this. You love to quote Shakespeare, both in your closing remarks and by the way, as a judge, right? You're a big Shakespeare guy.
And in real life, I steal from the best, David. I steal from the best. I quote you and Shakespeare.
Yeah. So you did quote Shakespeare. I was wondering how you were going to quote Shakespeare in this closing, and you quote Shakespeare about conspiracy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, because, I wanted the jury to have a sense that this is a really dark crime, and there is this passage from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, oh, conspiracy, shamest thou to show thy face, painting it as this darkest and most evil and most conniving of crimes, and then juxtaposing that with Pedro Guerrero, who's just the simplest of souls.
Right, you follow up Shakespeare with talking about Pedro.
Exactly. I kept, on a couple of occasions, if I recall, you have the transcript, but if I recall, I refer to him as the grand conspirator.
So right after Shakespeare, you say, conspiracy, this simpleton, this 11-year-old child in a man's body is a grand conspirator, and in his crimes he is alleged to have acted with intent to distribute. Understand what that means. If there's no proof of intent to distribute, proof beyond all reasonable doubt, then he must be acquitted because he's not charged with simple possession. Really, really good stuff.
And there wasn't enough.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting, so they go to his house, they search everything, they find nothing, right? I mean, why would they search the whole house if they thought they had enough with the tapes?
The drugs were supposed to be delivered to his garage. There had been talk about that.
So nothing found.
There was nothing. Well, they were delivering drugs, so they must have known that they weren't in the garage. Now, for whatever reason, I was very lucky. He and his wife had a daughter. She was 11 at the time of the events, 12 at the time of the trial. And she was in on the gymnastics club at junior high school, at middle school. And she had just come home wearing her gymnastics attire, And these guys come busting in with, raid jackets and flak vests and long guns. And she was literally sitting on the staircase, sobbing, crying. This is a child, for goodness sake. The wife, Pedro's wife, because they have family in the Dominican Republic, had bags or boxes, like cardboard boxes packed up of, clothing items, household items, soap, things like that they were detergent that they were going to ship because they're either impossible to get or impossible to afford in the Dominican Republic. They rummaged through all of that, throwing things all over the place.
I saw, and this is always a debate in our cases, that you brought the daughter to the trial and introduced her in opening.
I sure did.
Yeah. So was there a debate about her being too young to bring to a case like this, or that was an easy one for you?
Oh, I didn't have her sit through the whole thing. I just wanted her there to be introduced.
In opening, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And any worry that the jury might think, why are they bringing a young kid to the trial?
David, you and I have talked about one thing time and again. You can't deceive the 12-headed creature. If any lawyer who thinks he's going to fool a jury is living in a dream world. He's mistaken. Jurors may not understand everything cognitively, but they understand a great deal affectively. Did they realize that I had her there in part because of a desire for sympathy? I imagine they did.
Yeah.
I imagine they did. Does that mean it was wrong or valueless? No, I don't think it was.
Mm-hmm. We were in my class last night. We were talking about sentencing and how to persuade a judge, and we were doing now these sentencing videos, day in life videos, and the class was all asking, well, don't you think the judge is just going to think you're playing on emotion and sympathy? And I said, of course, that's the whole idea. Yeah. So let's go back to the closing. There's a great portion of the closing where you use Pedro's baseball card. And I'll let you tell the story because it's just too good.
It's going to sound strange, but when I was crossing Agent Lucerno, I wanted to bring out the fact that Pedro had no criminal record whatsoever, and that this was the kind of crime, the way they built it and the way they built it up, that would be done by experienced, hardened, knowledgeable, skilled drug dealers with connection. So I'm crossing him along this line, and I'm crossing him along this line. By and large, he's giving me the answers I need. And I said, and when you checked, you found that Pedro Guerrero had never been involved in any crime of any kind. And he said, well, we couldn't check. We didn't have his date of birth. Today, that sounds like an odd answer, because nowadays any government agency can find out anything about any of us.
Right.
But this is in 23 years ago. And apparently to get access to do a search on whatever databases they had in those days, they needed the date of birth. Uncharacteristically for me, I showed a lot of restraint. I didn't jump up and down right away. I saved it for closing, something I probably should have done more during my trial career than I did. In the trial, when they had those meetings at Hooters, they were so good and they set it up so nicely that when the informer introduced Agent Lucerno to Pedro, he said, this is my friend, whatever name he was using. When he heard that I know you, he just wanted to come. He's a huge fan. And the agent says, yeah, I've been your fan since I was a kid. I even have your baseball card. I've had it since I was a little boy. Would you autograph it for me? And Pedro autographs it.
Wow.
And at trial, they introduced the baseball card into evidence. So in closing argument, when I'm talking about how they couldn't trouble themselves to check to see that this grand conspirator had never had so much as a parking ticket, and their answer was, we didn't have his date of birth. And I picked up the card, which was exhibit number, whatever it was, and I look at the jurors and say, I know some of you collected baseball cards when you were kids. You know what's on the back of a baseball card? And I turn it over, and it says, born September 25th, 1956, San Pedro de Macorís, Dominican Republic.
Wow.
And I see jurors nodding like, yeah, anybody knows that.
So
anybody
good.
knows that. And they never looked on the back of the card. And I said, investigation can be harder, it can be easy, but just waiting for informants to bring your heads on a platter is the easiest of all.
Wow. So good. So the jury then goes out. By the way, before we get to that, one of the things I noticed about both your opening and closing, that it was a good reminder to me, is you don't have to give 2-hour openings and 2-hour closings. These were 15-page transcripts each, 16 pages, whatever it was. You won the case without giving 2 or 3 hour long openings and closings.
Every case is different. There are cases that justify very lengthy openings and closings. But I remind young lawyers, and if young lawyers are listening to this podcast, if you're going to give an opening or a closing that's more than 20 or 30 minutes in length, there are tools that you must employ to enable the jurors to hang on to key datum from those speeches that you're giving, because otherwise they're going to walk away with very little. And so, we try to talk about having a theme of the case and returning to the theme when you come to an important fact, using repetition, using different kinds of, there's a whole list of things that we have to do. There are an awful lot of cases, David, where 20, 25 minutes is more than enough.
Although, the old-time greats like Guerrero used to give 3-day closings.
Yeah.
How long was his closing when he represented himself? Some crazy long...
Well, he in jury selection, when he represented, it'll come to me when I don't want it. There was a trial in Detroit where a black physician had bought a house that bordered on a white neighborhood, and people came to attack him with guns, and he shot back in self-defense because he was prosecuted for the homicide. We laugh now. It was not funny at the time. And Darrow's jury selection lasted over 2 weeks.
Wow.
It was jury selection.
Yeah.
So you can't do that.
The jury goes out. Worst part for a criminal defense lawyer. There's nothing like it.
I always used to joke. You remember? I used to joke that I was going to do a diet video called "How I Lost 30 Pounds While the Jury Was Out."
Yeah, that's how it feels. But they come back and they find Pedro not guilty. Do you remember what it was like in the courtroom when that happened?
I remember exactly what it was like, because it was actually sort of macabre humor. The courtroom deputy reads the verdict. Pedro turns to me and says, I speak Spanish, and Pedro is more comfortable in Spanish. Turns to me and says in Spanish, "Did she say not guilty?" I can't believe it. Like, wasn't anybody paying any attention? And I tell him not guilty. He reaches over and he grabs me. Now, he'd been away from baseball for a while, but let me tell you, this guy was as strong as one of the Budweiser Clydesdales. He grabs me, and that does damage to a rib, whispers something to me. I whisper something back to him. So we're still in court. We got to behave ourselves. The courtroom deputy proceeds to set sentencing. There was sort of an awkward moment where we had to explain that actually, in case of acquittal, there is no need to set a date for sentencing. It hadn't happened in so long that she just sort of reflexively set the matter for sentencing hearing.
Hysterical.
So when I get outside, the reporter for the Miami Herald in those days was a guy named David Kidwell. This is before David Ovalle's time, or Jay Weaver's time. But the Miami Herald has always been blessed with fabulous crime reporters going back to Edna Buchanan and Carl Hyacin. Really fabulous crime reporters and trial reporters. And David Kidwell was no exception. He was terrific. And he grabs me and he says, I saw you and Pedro whisper together in that one moment when he finally realized, what did you say to each other? And I told him the truth. I said, he said to me, "You are the greatest lawyer of them all." And I said, "Pedro, you are the greatest dodger of them all." And Kidwell looks at me and says, "Is that Dodger with a capital D or a small d?" And I say, "I'm going to let the Miami Herald decide that." And he lit up like a kid at Christmas and went running off to wherever reporters go.
That is great. What a great story. And then, of course, you do all the news shows, including the O'Reilly show.
Yes.
And you got into it with O'Reilly. And this, I love telling this story to this day, because your exchange with O'Reilly is one of the great all-time exchanges, where he's on your case for using the too stupid defense and winning. And you tell him what?
Yeah, well, remember now, David, Bill O'Reilly was one of those guys who, before the camera starts rolling, is the most affable, chatty guy. Milton, I used to live in Miami, went to high school, blah, blah, blah. And then you're right, the camera starts rolling. He's, "How could you do such a thing, you miserable, wretched, blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Bill, don't worry. When you're indicted, I'm going to get you an acquittal the same way, too."
On the too stupid.
On the too stupid. Yeah, he was complaining that this was a fraud on the court, the too stupid defense. I said, "I'm going to get you an acquittal, too, Bill."
So great.
There was an article an editorial in one of the New York papers. I want to say the Post. I'm not from New York. I don't know the different papers. But whoever the sports editor or somebody was, wrote this editorial that began, "When I get arrested, somebody please call Milton Hirsch."
You can't pay for that kind of op-ed. It's great.
You cannot.
As criminal defense lawyers, we never sort of savor the victories long enough. We move too quickly to the new case, and we don't enjoy it. Did you have an opportunity to have a victory party and enjoy this, or were you on to the next case at the time?
No, you're so right, David. You're so right. It just dissipates into thin air. And, you get back to the office and all the calls you haven't returned, all the letters you haven't written, all the pleadings you need to get filed, all the other clients who are, hey, where are you? I paid you money,
Yeah.
Well, I haven't paid you money.
Yeah. Well, what a great case and a great, story and a wonderful acquittal. Whatever happened to Pedro after that? What did he?
David, bless his heart, like so many clients, nobody wants to remember his criminal defense attorney. That's an episode in a fellow's life that he would just as soon put in the past. To my knowledge, he went back to the Dominican Republic, although he does live a lot in Miami. I know he had some terrible health reverses a few years ago, but I have not heard from him, and that doesn't surprise me. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I am not a part of his life that he has any reason to want to remember.
He should have given you his World Series ring, as far as I'm concerned.
That would have been lovely, but it didn't happen. And anyway, David, I can't take a World Series ring from a non-Cubs player. I just can't take that.
Well, thank you, Milt. This was great. Really, really enjoyed the stories, and thank you for doing the show.
Great fun for me, and I encourage all young lawyers to watch you, David Markus, in trial when they have the chance.
Wasn't that awesome? Milt is so great. What an unbelievable trial lawyer, and what a great story. As soon as we finished the interview, I remembered one wonderful part that I forgot to ask him about, which was character witnesses that he called. He called folks like Ozzie Smith, and he asked Ozzie Smith, the famous shortstop for the Cardinals, who was so great. He asked him on the way out if he would do a backflip like he did going on to the field. So I kick myself after these interviews sometimes for the things I forgot to ask. In any event, what a great win. What a great story. We love Milt as a judge, but we miss him as a trial lawyer. And I know he still has some trials left in him after he finishes doing the great job on the bench. Next week, we'll be back in 2 weeks, actually. We're going to do it every other week. And next up, we're going to have Jerry Lefcourt from the Abby Hoffman Chicago 7 trial. I think you're going to find it fascinating. One of the biggest trials that we've ever had. And we welcome Jerry Lefcourt. I'll see you all in 2 weeks on For the Defense. Thanks.